brace yourself, because you're about to dive into another free first-hour episode of the Higher Side Chats, and we just want to let you know that whether you're looking for a companion through your paranoid insomnia, entertaining yourself through one of life's mundane activities, or trying to ward off the internal screams of all those sad, smothered souls around the office, THC is here. And you should know that every episode of the Higher Side Chats has an entire second hour for Plus members. Sign up at thehighersidechatsplus.com and you'll get years of Plus show archives, lifetime forum access, a special invite to Greg Carlwood's monthly joint sessions, MP3s of THC music, bonus episodes, tour videos, and 10% off t-shirts, grinders, and whatever else ends up in the Higher Side store. It's $8 a month that you won't miss, so become a Plus member and treat yourself in these troubled times. Always action-packed and commercial-free, which means you'll unfortunately never hear my voice again.
In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Fireside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. Well, we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higher Side Chats. Here we go, people. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood, and we've been at this long enough by now to know that the corporate media is not doing the job that media should do. In fact, they act more as a filter for making sure certain scandals take precedent over others, that they fuel the fires of the two-party rage, that stories like the Epstein saga don't get deep enough to expose the whole system, and maybe most importantly, that their sponsors and partners are properly shielded from any negative press. And it's getting so bad now that even people who have drank the corporate media Kool-Aid for years are seeing through the carefully crafted narratives and are looking anywhere they can to find some integrity, objectivity, and actual intelligence in their news. Well, folks, I hope today's show marks a digital signpost to point you to the work of our amazing guest, Whitney Webb. Not only has Whitney gotten some well-deserved recent attention for her incredibly detailed deep dive into the Epstein saga with her book-length 4-part series, The Jeffrey Epstein Scandal: Too Big to Fail, but she's also written about a number of subjects few others are, including international election meddling, CIA coups, the weaponized algorithms of Silicon Valley, the finer points of the cozy relationship between the US and Israel, and so much more. Whitney is currently working as a Mint Press News journalist based in Chile, but she has also contributed to several independent media outlets including Global Research, EcoWatch, the Ron Paul Institute, and 21st Century Wire, among others. She's also made several radio and television appearances now as well, and is the 2019 winner of the Serena Shim Award for Uncompromising Integrity in Journalism, and that is no small thing. So let's get into it. Boldly going where few others dare to tread, the criminal cabal caller-outer, the independent journalist extraordinaire, and a righteous thorn in the paw of the empire. Whitney the Web Exposer Webb, welcome to the Higher Side.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be here.
Yes, well, thanks for doing it. I know you're in high demand after your Epstein coverage. Really amazing work there, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But I am intrigued by some of the more global aspects of your work, and even your move to Chile. Obviously, a lot of us can get stuck in the American bubble and we lose sight of our global view. Even on a show like this, we might cover 5G or geoengineering or MKUltra even, and we talk a lot about how the capstone cabal affects the American microcosm, but we don't get out of that lane as much as we should. So, to kick this off, I'm curious to hear a bit about your experience moving out of the States and how you see the big empire affecting the region of the world where you now reside.
Well, I originally came to South America thinking I wanted to get away from stuff in the U.S. that I saw, that's still going on today, but, I saw coming anyway, like a long time ago when I left in 2012 after I graduated from college. And I kind of thought that here in the middle of nowhere in southern Chile, because I live pretty far down south, not that far from Antarctica, actually. I thought I would, be safe here, right? But the more I learned about, South America specifically and some of the geopolitical things going on in Patagonia specifically, which is, the region where I live, I came to realize that a lot of the stuff I was writing about was actually, also very much affecting where I was living. And I actually ended up starting a series earlier this year about some really crazy stuff going on in Patagonia with actually a lot of the billionaires and some billionaires that are connected to the so-called mega group that were backing Jeffrey Epstein and some other crazy stuff. And they're basically, some of them, including this one British billionaire, this guy named Joe Lewis. I mean, he's essentially made like a parallel state in Patagonia. He has this property that borders this lake, and all these locals, have a government right to go and visit that lake because it's a public lake. And he basically has private security guards almost drown people for getting close to it, and does all this other really crazy stuff. And there's a lot more going on than that. There's actually a lot of indications and concern in people in Argentina and also in Chile that there's these upcoming efforts led by the IMF actually to basically try and partition Patagonia and make it a separate country, basically sort of like a feeding ground of, new raw materials for the global financial elite. So yeah, I'll be writing more on that in a couple months and start up that series again when a lot of my Epstein stuff is concluded. But basically, that series really shows that really no matter where you go in the world, you're going to find this stuff. I mean, this is really these types of, I guess you could call it American empire, or you could call it I wouldn't just call it, the global power elite empire. They really have their tentacles everywhere, so to speak. So it's kind of hard to really live anywhere these days and not have some sort of interaction with it. But, the nice part about Chile is that where I live anyway, it's nice and it's relaxed. So it's easy to forget about that stuff here still. It's not staring you in the face every day.
Well, that is a silver lining, but you're right. I mean, South America is really ripe for resource plunder. Of course, I've heard a lot about Brazil's election last year. There was a lot of hacking and meddling. And now the Amazon is on fire. There's a lot of speculation as to hidden motives there. I mean, corporate interests would love to come in and take that land, so you can't put anything past them, really.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And as far as the Amazon goes, I mean, there's definitely been interest in Argentina and a lot of in Brazil, and a lot of them are foreign and even from other countries in Latin America, oligarchs from countries like Argentina, for example, that have had a longstanding interest in increasing Brazil's meat industry. And because cattle ranching is one of the main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. But another thing that's really crazy that goes on that I have personal experience with actually has to do with mining in the Andes. And that's one of the main, resource plundering efforts underway near where I live. They're trying to dam up all the rivers in Chile to make these hydroelectric power plants. And they're claiming that it's for, the people to give renewable energy. But everywhere they've been installed, they don't connect to local communities. And they basically are the first phase of bringing mining to these areas where mining didn't exist before, because the Andes are really rich in copper and a lot of other minerals. So basically they try and get these hydroelectric power plants installed, and then they bring in the mines. And these plants aren't for the people like they try and sell them as. They're for the mines, but they have this really effective PR campaign of trying to be like, it's sustainable energy, but it really, it's really something entirely different. What goes on in other places in South America are really nuts in relation to that too. Like I used to live in Peru. I actually used to manage a farm in a really rural area of Peru, not that far from Cusco. So like way up in the Andes. And there was all these battles between locals and these big, really predatory mine companies that really, are really destructive environmentally, but they also get along quite poorly with the locals and really ignore what local communities want. Probably like 10 kilometers from where I was living, a group of angry locals like burned down housing for this mine that was near where I lived. And then the mine company responded basically by sending in, getting the Peruvian military sent in, and the so-called ringleaders, they basically just pushed them off cliffs. It was like really, that sort of thing that goes on, you don't really hear about in mainstream media, whether it's in South America or or in the US or really anywhere else, but a lot of these mining companies are either, British or American, Chinese, or Australian, generally speaking. And they basically, have the local governments at their beck and call, and they do these sort of extrajudicial killings. Another really crazy case that I've written about before, but is really not well known, is how this mine that originally used to be owned by ExxonMobil, I forget what company owns it now, but I think it's an American company still. They basically used a hydroelectric dam that they again sold as being sustainable energy to basically divert the only river that went to the largest indigenous community of Colombia, the Wayuu. And that was in 2011. And between 2011 and 2016, like 5,000 kids died because they didn't have any water in this community, and they can't grow their own food. They barely have a liter of water to live off of. And all of the river was diverted to this mine, and they use the water just to clean the roads to improve visibility. They water the roads all day, while this community not that far from there is just, they're literally dying of thirst in record numbers. And it's just totally insane. So yeah, South America is full of cases like that. But because, corporate media, whether it's in Latin America or it's in the United States or anywhere else, really, they don't really cover this stuff, so no one really knows and there's no pushback.
And I'm really glad you laid out some of those cases. I mean, this confessions of an economic hitman type of stuff is very much par for the course, but I do like to make people aware of it because the folks that are affected here, they don't really have a voice. So it is important to remember them. I mean, we complain about the American empire from within it, and, there's a lot to complain about, but it's a lot worse for other people outside of it, and I think they deserve some attention. And you wrote a really interesting piece about Venezuela before the Epstein coverage came about, entitled How GMO Seeds and Monsanto/Bayer's Roundup Are Driving U.S. Policy in Venezuela. And you say, it is telling that the top political donors in the U.S. most aggressively pushing regime change in Venezuela have close ties to Monsanto and major financial stakes in Bayer. Well, yeah, that's definitely telling. It seems like GMO crops and global food supply control is a big aspect of international politics now. But can you tell us a little bit more about that article and that situation?
Yeah, well, in Venezuela specifically, this goes back to, I think it was 2004 when Hugo Chavez, he and the legislature at the time, they enacted this really progressive seed law and this ban on GMO crops in Venezuela. That's still in effect, and it actually has been very strongly opposed by the party of Juan Guaido, who is, of course, the interim president. His party, Popular Will, and the Roundtable of Democratic Unity, which is sort of this umbrella group of U.S.-backed Venezuelan opposition parties. They've basically made it their mission to try and repeal it, and they've tried numerous times and have been unsuccessful. But actually, around the time I wrote this article, Juan Guaido had released his plan for Venezuela as interim president, or U.S. handpicked president. And his plan was called Plan País, or country plan. And one of the things he kept talking about repeatedly that didn't really get any media attention at the time was agriculture, and basically opening up Venezuela and renovating agriculture and making it this big agricultural hub, because even though Venezuela has a lot of fertile land and one would assume should have a booming agricultural sector, it's actually a very neglected agricultural sector. But this is something that precedes Chavez by several decades. This actually goes back to the 1940s when basically the oil industry in Venezuela took over and basically led to almost every other sector of Venezuela's economy being neglected in favor of the oil sector. And Chavez tried to reverse that a little bit, but he certainly did not go far enough. I mean, that's one of the several criticisms that one could make of Chavez from the left even. But what we see here with Juan Guaido is that he was basically, there were some sort of buzzwords, in his presentation of Plan País that suggested that there was going to be the repeal of the seed law and this GMO ban that had been in effect for a long time. And what's interesting, of course, is that one of the main backers of this Venezuelan regime change efforts in the United States is Marco Rubio. And of course, the Trump administration, and a major backer to Marco Rubio, and also a more recent backer of President Trump after he was elected, is this guy named Paul Singer, who is this, he's often called a vulture capitalist. He's very well known in Latin America, including Argentina, for his predatory activities, basically, trying to buy up debt on companies. He tried to basically crash Argentina's economy again when Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was president. And he recently, at a time when all other investors of Bayer Monsanto, because Bayer and Monsanto merged, they were all trying to reduce their stock because I'm sure a lot of people know following the news that Monsanto has been, or Bayer rather, has been in a lot of trouble over Monsanto's flagship product, Roundup or glyphosate, because there have been all of these trials in the U.S. Awarding large sums of money to people who have claimed and won settlements about glyphosate causing cancer. So, of course, for any other investor, this would not be the time to buy stock in Bayer. But Paul Singer has been buying considerable stock in Bayer at a time when everyone else is fleeing, which is quite odd. But when you look at his history of being this quote-unquote vulture capitalist and his backing of a lot of the politicians very much involved in this effort of backing Juan Guaido, and Juan Guaido, of course, talking about the need to repeal this ban and, really beef up the agricultural sector in Venezuela if he succeeds in taking Venezuela's government, may suggest why Paul Singer was so interested in obtaining more stock in Bayer during this time. Because what we've seen in a lot of other cases where, there's been a regime change, for example, in Ukraine, basically before 2014 in Ukraine, there was not a lot of GMO crops. And then after the coup, the IMF and the World Bank basically, as a stipulation in giving Ukraine's new government these loans, basically forced Ukraine to accept biotechnology and GMO crops into its agricultural sector. So it would make sense to assume that the same thing would happen in Venezuela. And it looks like that Paul Singer is already preparing to make a profit off of that, which would fit with his entire history as part of his, activities in managing his hedge fund, which I believe is called Elliott Capital Management.
Man, you just know so much about this stuff. And I was trying to do some reading about updates with this fight for regime change. We have Guaido, that's the U.S.-backed leader, and then we have Chavez's successor, Maduro. And what I was reading was kind of confusing as to what's going on now. It almost seemed like just some kind of stalemate while the country just is halted. Is that what's going on? Is there an update? Has one side won over the other?
I think it's more or less a stalemate. I mean, to me, it honestly looks like Maduro's holding on, but they're trying to really tighten the noose of sanctions even more. I haven't really been following this particularly closely in the last month because I've been so focused on this Epstein stuff, right? But the strategy seems to be to basically choke off their ability to sell their oil abroad and to prevent them from receiving or importing anything. And this is really crazy, though, because Venezuela has, for the reason I mentioned earlier, that they never really diversified their economy even before Chavez. They import the vast majority of their food, and they import a lot of other things. And so, of course, this is causing a lot of hardship in Venezuela. In Latin America, there's a lot of Venezuelan people from Venezuela basically trying to, immigrate to other countries, including Chile, where I live. But some of the ones I've talked to, there's some that really hate Maduro, and there's some that, don't really care either way or even like the guy. They just, they don't want to suffer, these collective punishment sanctions that ultimately punish, regular civilians and don't really do anything to target Maduro specifically. Because what these sanctions do is basically the strategy behind them is to make life for civilians in the targeted country so miserable that they rise up and overthrow the government just to end the economic, the economic siege is really what it comes down to. Basically, I think the U.S. strategy is to try and tighten the noose as much as possible and wait it out. And then when the time comes, put Juan Guaido in if they manage in succeeding them. But there's so many people in Venezuela that do not want the gringos, right, to come and take over. And even if they don't like Maduro, some of them prefer him, at least a Venezuelan being in power, to someone they see as a puppet of the United States being in power. And it's worth pointing out, too, that Juan Guaido's political party, which is called Popular Will, or Voluntad Popular, it's really led, even though Juan Guaido is like sort of the interim president, the real power behind Juan Guaido and his mentor is this guy named Leopoldo Lopez. And Leopoldo Lopez, during this failed coup attempt earlier this year, where Guaido and Lopez claimed that they had taken a military base, even though they really didn't. Some people may remember that. Actually, during that time, Leopoldo Lopez told a group of reporters that were present there for international outlets, including Bloomberg and some other ones, that the plan was, once Guaido and popular will is in power in Venezuela, to bring in the U.S. government as part of the government of Venezuela, which to a lot of people basically means make Venezuela a colony of the United States. So obviously people in Venezuela, anyone that cares about national sovereignty, whether they like Maduro or not, may prefer Maduro to that option.
Wow. And yes, I definitely think that this GMO politics thing is a big part of what the American empire is doing, working on behalf of these major billion-dollar multinational corporations like Monsanto and Bayer, and it obviously extends beyond Venezuela. Just one other detail you mentioned is that when Brazil sought to expand their biotechnology investment in 2012, Monsanto saw a 21% increase in its sales of GMO corn seed alone, generating an additional $1 billion in profits for the company. So this is no small thing. It's not super surprising why a guy like Paul Singer would be investing in this while everyone's running for the hills, because he probably knows that they get their way regardless of how much bad PR is out there. And I guess one other important topic I wanted to touch on before we get into your Epstein coverage is the piece you wrote called The Trust Project: Big Media and Silicon Valley's Weaponized Algorithms Silence Dissent. And you say, given the Trust Project's rich get richer impact on the online news landscape, it is not surprising to find that it is funded by a confluence of tech oligarchs and powerful forces with a clear stake in controlling the flow of news. What can you tell us about the Trust Project and who's behind us? What worries you about this?
Okay, so the Trust Project, they describe themselves as sort of this a consortium of top news companies that have basically gotten together to fight against the scourge that everyone knows about after 2016, known as fake news, right? So basically what the public face of this is, like, you know, if you're a Trust Project partner, what you have to be approved by the Trust Project to become a partner. Not anyone can partner up. You have to be chosen by them. You can put like the little T symbol of the Trust Project on your webpage for people to see, which is all nice, and it tells people about the commitments you've made to newsroom transparency. You can also see, in a table that the Trust Project has set up called the Newsroom Transparency Tracker. But, it's kind of absurd, because even though they claim this is about promoting transparency, what this Newsroom Transparency stuff actually does is it conflates actual transparency practices with simply providing the Trust Project the official policies and guidelines about their indicators specifically. So like outlets like The Economist and get like a perfect score, even though The Economist, I think a lot of your listeners will probably know, who owns The Economist and what that's about. So that's just kind of silly, but I think that's just the public face of the Trust Project. As I point out in my piece, the real power of this, because the Trust Project, right, it was co-founded with the head of Google News, or the vice president of Google for Google News, who's basically the head of Google News. Basically what this does is that this is the private part of the Trust Project, which is obviously the most powerful and less transparent part of this organization. And basically what it does is that if you're a Trust Project partner and you are approved by this consortium of top mainstream media news companies, you are allowed to embed this HTML code, or these snippets of code really, that they call machine readable signals. And basically what that does is that the algorithms of Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft's Bing, these big tech websites, they basically prioritize your content over other content. So, for example, a lot of independent media pages, including the one I write for, have noticed that after the 2016 election, we had been censored very heavily by Facebook and by Google and by Twitter. But if you manage to get one of these snippets of code, access to them, and you get to embed it in the site of your page, it's sort of like a workaround for those same algorithms. So basically, these super repressive algorithms totally throttle the spread of information of pages that aren't partners. But if you're partnered and chosen by them, you get basically what amounts to preferential treatment, and you get your results ranked first. And basically, all the other independent media outlets that aren't Trust Project approved get bogged down. This is troubling when you look not just at the fact that, the Trust Project is nominally formed of just, mainstream media outlets, but the fact that it's largely funded by Google and Facebook themselves. So it's basically this way of fighting fake news, but sort of like self-funding the solution to fake news, which is, there's been a lot of criticisms of Google and Facebook and how, they're basically, they are government contractors, a lot of these Silicon Valley pages. And basically, they're deciding who is real news and who is fake news. I mean, basically the Trust Project is a way of giving that type of power to these increasingly powerful Silicon Valley behemoths who have increasing ties to the military-industrial complex in the United States. And also, the military-industrial complex or intelligence communities of other countries, which is quite troubling. And one of the main oligarchs there is a guy that the site I write for has criticized a whole lot. And his name is Pierre Omidyar. He's the founder of eBay, but he's also known today as the current owner of PayPal. And he also is, of course, known because he funds The Intercept and some, other news outlets. So Pierre Omidyar, of course, has a lot of deep ties to the U.S. intelligence community. He had a lot of ties to the Obama White House and has consistently been up to a lot of no good, I would say. But basically, it's giving these sort of tech oligarchs power to decide what is news and what is not. And this is really troubling, too, when you consider that Pierre Omidyar recently teamed up with Bill Kristol and funded Bill Kristol's Alliance for Securing Democracy, which basically had this Russian bot dashboard, it was called, Hamilton 68, that was super untransparent. And basically anything that trended on Twitter, the establishment didn't want to trend. It would be used to blame that on alleged Russian bots without proof, right? So this is something that Pierre Omidyar was funding. He's also funding the Trust Project, which seems sort of contradictory, doesn't it? So there's a lot to be worried about when it comes to the Trust Project. And I think the only really way to get around it is trying to find out what these snippets of code are and sort of guerrilla embed them in independent media sites as sort of a workaround.
Yeah, codes. Give me those codes. But I'm with you. This is very important, and it seems like a pretty transparent attack on alternative media. Let's circle the wagons, promote only the inner circle groups, and the rest will hopefully die off eventually because they can't reach the same audience without the support of the big five platforms. I mean, yes, that's definitely a concern, and I'm glad we could spend some time on it. I just wanted to make sure we talked about some of your other work because a lot of important things are happening out there, even though the Jeffrey Epstein story is the most trendy and the most juicy. And there are a lot of journalists trying to cover the Epstein saga, and your work has definitely been catapulted to the front of the pack. And it's hard work to do because the trail runs dark in a lot of places. But why do you think your coverage of the Epstein scandal has been so popular and such a standout? What have you picked up on that maybe others have missed?
Well, what I think I did is I think I just took a different approach because I was personally curious about one thing in particular, which had to do with Alex Acosta saying that Jeffrey Epstein had ties to intelligence. When that came out, of course, I was just interested in, I had planned to just write a report about the history of sexual blackmail operations conducted by the CIA, or at least in the United States. And so, of course, that's how this whole series started, because digging into that history, I found things I didn't expect to find, which basically led me to this thread, I guess you could call it. And the more I pulled on it, the more it became apparent that Jeffrey Epstein really is, the latest iteration of an operation that has been going on for a very long time, actually going back to really the genesis of some of the U.S.'s most well-known intelligence agencies, specifically the CIA, of course, which would be around the 1940s, and that this really began with organized crime in the United States. And of course, organized crime in World War II sort of forged this alliance with U.S. intelligence. And even though that was supposed to end after the war, as so many of these other unsavory alliances that have happened over U.S. history, even though they're supposed to end at a certain time, they don't, and they end up becoming indefinite. And this is one such case. So I think the fact that I just may have been the first person to find this thread in particular, which, the beginning of this this network and this operation involved in sexual blackmail operations is the topic of part 1 of my series, where I go into that a bit, and I basically trace this back to the National Crime Syndicate, which was co-founded by Mayor Lansky of the Jewish mob and Charles Lucky Luciano of the Genovese crime family, and how that syndicate in particular got in bed with intelligence, as I said, and how a lot of their associates also became involved in this type of activity, and how those same ties we see today, in terms of looking at Jeffrey Epstein's connections, not just to intelligence, but some of his business associates who was funding him, things like that.
Yes, the way you take it back is so intriguing. A big element to me is that you take it back to CIA gun and drug running and like the Iran-Contra era, and you say, look, they were doing that, but nobody was talking about the child trafficking going on in this mix too. And that's definitely a third rail to all of this. And maybe it's kind of coming out now. It's more known about now than it was then, but you can kind of take this Epstein thing right back to then.
Right, for sure. Well, the crazy thing about Iran-Contra is that, like you mentioned, this was basically when, I guess you could call it the business aspect of the CIA, was basically had expanded to include arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, and also sex trafficking. And that, as I mentioned earlier with organized crime, a lot of those were quote unquote businesses that used to be run by organized crime. And basically, the CIA, by virtue of its, formal alliance with this national crime syndicate, basically became the organized crime branch of the U.S. government. And a lot of its activity that we see going on in Iran-Contra, reflects that pretty clearly. And of course, it's worth pointing out, too, that Iran-Contra was basically, covered up and forgotten about. A lot of the people that were charged for it with really light sentences ended up being pardoned. And so because of that lack of accountability, even just looking at Iran-Contra alone has allowed not only that activity to continue, but I would argue has allowed it to expand and proliferate, and fully explains why someone someone like Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to basically run a sexual blackmail operation involving rich and powerful people that exploited underage girls for so long. The reason he was allowed to do this and able to do this for decades is because he clearly had some sort of state protection. And that's why we ended up seeing Alex Acosta being told when he was, a federal prosecutor in Florida, that he had to negotiate the sweetheart deal for Epstein back in 2007 because Epstein was tied to intelligence, even though he was facing, charges then potentially for sex trafficking of minors. Of course, those charges were filed against him this year when he was arrested in July. So what happens during this period with Iran-Contra is that, during the 1980s, a couple of these sexual blackmail operations or pedophile rings even came to light, which had not really happened much in the past. And what we see, though, is about the ones that did get some sort of press coverage, they ended up being connected. Specifically, they were connected to this operation that I was referencing earlier that began with organized crime, when organized crime and the CIA sort of joined together first in the late 40s. And then I should probably talk about that first ring for a second before getting into the later iterations of that came up around in Iran-Contra. Basically, the original ring that I trace sort of this network around Jeffrey Epstein back to was first started by a man named Louis Rosenstiel, who was this Mayor Lansky connected, very close to Mayor Lansky, businessman involved in the liquor industry. And his company at the time was Shinley Liquors, and he ran a sexual blackmail operation involving underage boys out of his home. Later, this expanded during the anti-communist crusade and got some sort of government protection, apparently, at some point, because it ended up involving former director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who, of course, was well known for his penchant for blackmail. And it also involved Roy Cohn, who then was general counsel to Joseph McCarthy, and later, of course, became a mentor to people like President Donald Trump and Roger Stone, and was very deeply connected himself to the Reagan White House. So that first began in the 1950s. During this period of the Red Scare and whatnot, and continued well into at least the early 1980s. I assume that when Roy Cohn became really ill around 1984, 1985, he stopped really engaging in those type of activities, but I don't really know for sure. But Roy Cohn died in 1986. But anyway, some of these other rings that came up in Iran-Contra, one of the most well-known ones by people that sort of have looked into this sort of stuff is one that was run by this guy named Craig Spence. And Craig Spence was a really prominent lobbyist in Washington, mainly, I believe he was mainly connected with the Republican Party. And I couldn't track down exactly when he began his lobbying activities, but they were in full swing by 1982, because that's when the New York Times wrote an entire profile about Spence. And a lot of the language used to describe Spence is very similar to what we see about Jeffrey Epstein. So Craig Spence was, he was compared to Jay Gatsby from the Great Gatsby novel. This mysterious wealthy figure, comparison that was also made in later years with Jeffrey Epstein. Craig Spence was said to have, parties in a phone book that were basically a who's who of powerful people in the government, in media, in business. Things like that he was sought out by people for his connections, arguably more than what he actually knew about businesses and things like that he was sought out, for his connections more than anything else. And that the main thing, though, is that the New York Times piece notes that he was well known for throwing these lavish parties that had a lot of notable people attending, including, celebrities from Hollywood and also senators and top military officials, things like that. And that he claimed to be a close friend to people like Richard Nixon, Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, who actually Jeffrey Epstein later claimed to be personal friends with as well, and some other figures. But actually it came out, I think it was in 1989 from the Washington Times, that Spence was actually, had been running a homosexual prostitution ring involving underage boys, and that his his quote-unquote clients of this ring included powerful people in government, powerful people in the military, powerful people in business, the financial world, and the media, among other industries. And that he had basically tried to entrap people into compromising sexual encounters with these kids. And he had his house bugged with recording equipment. He had like a two-way mirror. And for people that he couldn't entrap into these sexual activities, he would try and, entrap them with cocaine and some other illegal drugs. So basically, he was involved in acquiring blackmail. And it appears that he also had ties to intelligence and may have been doing this on behalf of the CIA, because Spence actually claimed that he worked for the CIA to people that attended his parties. He told several people that knew him well that he was afraid the CIA might double cross him and kill him and make it look like a suicide. And actually, that is what happened to Spence. He was found dead in the Boston Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and his death was quickly ruled a suicide, not unlike some of the circumstances surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's death. And actually, Spence appears to have been involved to some extent in the drug running activities of the 1980s, because he claimed that the cocaine that he had at his parties, he had acquired it by doing smuggling cocaine into the U.S. from El Salvador, and that he did that in connection with people from the U.S. military. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, he claimed to be working with the CIA. And probably the most convincing evidence about Spence's ties to powerful politicians is the fact that he actually took some of these underage boys to the White House on midnight tours of the White House. And Spence claimed that the person who helped him arrange this was actually George Bush Sr.'s national security advisor, Donald Gregg, who had worked from the CIA, I believe, from 1951 to 1982, and had worked directly under William Casey, who was the director of the CIA under Reagan. And of course, William Casey was one of the people that attended Spence's, blackmail parties where these underage boys were present. But also Roy Cohn was there, and I just mentioned Roy Cohn was involved in one of these activities earlier. And actually, one of the people that Craig Spence claimed to be closest to before his fall from grace was Roy Cohn, and he actually hosted birthday parties for Roy Cohn at his personal home, and they were apparently really close. So given the overlap in activities there, I would argue that there is likely some sort of connection between the two. And of course, we know that Craig Spence, the investigation of his sex ring later led to the discovery of what is arguably the most well-known pedophile ring of the period, which is, the one that was run by Larry King out of Omaha, Nebraska, and is often just referred to as the Franklin ring or the Franklin scandal, because basically by looking at Spence's finances, and they came across Larry King's name. Of course, I'm not talking about Larry King, the journalist. This is some other guy, for people who may be confused. But basically, Larry King was this Republican, I guess you could say activist or lobbyist, really, who was running this credit union that was basically a sham credit union, and was basically a front for this child sex abuse ring. And actually, children were killed as a part of it. It really disturbing stuff. But basically, King had a lot of connections to Iran-Contra type things and also the Reagan administration. There were also ties to the CIA. A lot of people have reported on the Franklin scandal, and I'm not claiming to be an expert here, but I did, going through a lot of the research that other people have done in the Franklin scandal. I mean, and the fact that Iran-Contra, that network of intelligence and all these other things that developed during this time, it's quite compelling that, we can see sort of a direct line from this. From the first ring I talk about to here, and then from these Iran-Contra rings later to Jeffrey Epstein. But anyway, staying on King for a second, Larry King co-founded, as an example, he co-founded this group with this guy named David Carman that was called Citizens for America, and it actually sponsored speaking trips for Oliver North, who was like one of the main people involved in Iran-Contra, and also leaders for the Contra paramilitary members in Nicaragua. And David Carman, who Larry King co-founded this with, he ran a public relations firm with the former head of covert operations at the CIA, Max Hugel. And David Carman's father, who was also a part of this PR firm, was the head of the General Services Administration under Reagan and later became an ambassador under Ronald Reagan as well. So he was definitely connected to this stuff going on. And also the credit union that was a front for this company also did business with another rather suspect savings and loan company that was actually partially run by Neil Bush, who was the brother of George H.W. Bush and the son of George Bush Sr. So again, a lot of disturbing connections there as well. But so how does Jeffrey Epstein fit into this, right? I guess that's probably what a lot of your listeners...
It's deep, but yes, that's probably on the minds of people.
Yeah. So I guess this would be a good point then to go back into Jeffrey Epstein's past, and then you can see it's pretty easy to see there how he ties in with this Iran-Contra network and how that changes moving forward.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but on the subject of Jeffrey Epstein's past, I just wanted to ask you about this because the last time we covered Epstein in depth, I definitely emphasized this story about how William Barr's father hired him at the Dalton school and how weird that was. And I had a bunch of people write me and they were saying, this is not true, that Donald Barr actually quit before he hired Epstein. And I was a little upset. I don't want to be throwing out information that's incorrect, but now I'm finding so many different opinions, and I just wanted to know if we're going to talk about Epstein's background, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that episode at the Dalton school and this idea of was he or wasn't he hired by Donald Barr, because you've looked into this quite deeply.
Right. So it's understandable why these conflicting opinions about Donald Barr and his role with Jeffrey Epstein exist. And this can all pretty much be traced back to a report in the Daily Beast that said that Donald Barr had left, was no longer headmaster at the Dalton School by the time that Jeffrey Epstein had been hired, and thus was not involved in the hiring of Jeffrey Epstein. We know that Donald Barr left the Dalton School as headmaster at the end of June 1974, and that Epstein began the following semester as a math teacher, I believe in September of 1974. So that is why people are saying that he was not involved in the hiring of Epstein, and that goes back to this Daily Beast report that I just mentioned. But actually, a week after it was published and had been widely circulated and used to debunk this claim, the Daily Beast actually updated this report. So anyone that is confused here, I would just, urge you to go back and look at the original Daily Beast report, because it has been updated to no longer claim that Donald Barr did not hire Jeffrey Epstein. And this is because they got in touch with the person that was the interim headmaster after Donald Barr left the school. And he claimed that by the time he had started, Jeffrey Epstein had already been hired. He had no recollection of hiring Jeffrey Epstein. And he, as well as other people that were later interviewed by the Daily Beast, said that hiring decisions were made in the spring, which would mean that when hiring decisions were made in the spring, Donald Barr was still headmaster. Right. And also other people, not just the interim headmaster, but other people that worked at the school said that Donald Barr was well known for hiring, quote unquote, unconventional teachers. And this means, basically the Donald Barr's reasoning was said to have been that he felt that, people that didn't have the traditional background that one would expect teachers to have at this elite private school would enrich the lives and the academic experience of the students. And of course, Epstein fits into that category because when he was hired to work at the school, he didn't have a college degree. He hadn't finished his studies at university. So he was considered to be an unconventional hire. And also the New York Times did, I think, a whole article about his unconventional behavior while at the Dalton School. So let's talk about Donald Barr for a second, because the timing, based on what I just described, seems to indicate, of course, Donald Barr can't confirm or deny what went on because he's dead. Right. And this was a really long time ago. This was in the early 70s. So it seems unlikely at this point that more information will come out than what I've already mentioned. But we do know that Donald Barr used to work for the forerunner to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, which of course is the intelligence agency that first created this formal alliance with this organized crime syndicate that I mentioned earlier. And actually, at the time in 1974, when Epstein was hired and when Donald Barr was still headmaster, William Barr, his son, who's the current attorney general, was working for the CIA. So that point gets overlooked a little bit because there was still, at that point in time that Epstein was hired, Donald Barr had direct family connections to the CIA, even though he had left the OSS a few decades before, right? Something else that's really weird too, that I mentioned in my report and some other people have picked up on as well, is that a year before he hired Epstein, Donald Barr had an interest in science fiction, and he wrote a science fiction novel called Space Relations that is about human trafficking and sexual slavery, which is quite interesting given what we know that what Epstein was later up to, and also what the CIA was actually involved in during the 1970s when Epstein was hired, actually, because one of the things that William Barr was actually involved in during this period of time that Epstein was at the Dalton School was stonewalling the church committee, because he was the liaison to Congress between the CIA and Congress during the church committee investigation. And one of the things that he fought tooth and nail to keep coming out to the public was the CIA's use of sexual blackmail operations targeting foreign diplomats. So that's another odd connection there, right? So I can understand why people are confused about the Donald Barr thing, because generally when a new report comes out, a lot of people know the original report, but if it's corrected or updated, they don't necessarily know that, right? So anyone that hasn't heard or read the information I'm talking about, please go back to that Daily Beast article and read what they put out there. Because, if you're going to buy or if you're going to, promote the original claim made by this Daily Beast article, it would make sense to read the update and the correction they issued.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thanks for pointing that out, because it's just a particularly important update for this audience, given the way Epstein was covered in a previous show. And these things do get complicated. But as you note, it's not the only reason to be suspect, to be skeptical about Donald Barr. I mean, the whole Donald Barr being in this shadowy network doesn't hinge on the fact that he hired Epstein. He's got this strange book, and he's got these other connections to intelligence.
Right. And let's also remember, too, that I think one of the reasons that, there's been so much pushback against this point in particular is the fact that William Barr has not recused himself from the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and people were using that point to call on him to recuse himself, right? But even if it wasn't for that, William Barr, if he actually cared, would recuse himself, just by virtue of the fact that before becoming Attorney General this time, he worked at the law firm where Epstein's defense attorneys came from when the Sweetheart deal was negotiated in 2007. And if you go even farther back than when he was Attorney General the first time, he was involved in the cover-up of Iran-Contra and justified the legality of the pardons for all these Iran-Contra figures. And of course, as we just talked about, right, Iran-Contra had a lot of involvement in these types of activities. So, that's quite, he's basically a cover-up master. And as I mentioned earlier, when with the church committee, he was trying to keep information from the public regarding sexual blackmail operations. So he really does not seem to be the right person to be in charge of basically overseeing these two separate Department of Justice investigations into what happened to Epstein when he was allegedly found dead in his cell.
Right. And not to jump all over the place, but I also heard another detail from one of your previous interviews that it seems like maybe Barr had made a promise to Clinton or suggest to Clinton that if he could keep the stuff going on in Mena, Arkansas under wraps, that he might be in line for the presidency.
Yeah, well, that's coming from a former CIA agent that worked directly under Oliver North and was involved in the stuff going on in Mena, Arkansas during Iran-Contra. But we can get to that in a bit when we get to the Clintons. Because really quickly, I wanted to go through Jeffrey Epstein's history, and we can, after that, just go into the how the Clintons tie into Iran-Contra stuff as well. But since we're talking about the Dalton School, right, Jeffrey Epstein leaves the Dalton School under rather mysterious circumstances. There's conflicting accounts of why he was let go, but he was let go. He didn't leave of his own accord, and he ended up leaving. And of course, he gets another quite fortuitous, hiring luck with being hired by the elite investment bank, Bear Stearns, even though he has no trading experience and no college degree and is just some math teacher, right? And he's hired directly by the head of Bear Stearns himself, Alan Greenberg. And Alan Greenberg claimed that the reason he hired Epstein is because Epstein was so nice to his kids who he tutored. But that seems kind of like an odd reason to hire someone to basically trade money for your clients at your fancy investment bank, even though they have no trading experience. Right. So basically, Epstein becomes a partner pretty quickly in Bear Stearns, and he again ends up leaving under a cloud of secrecy. And it's not, there's again conflicting reasons given from different people why he left. But basically, the Epstein's claim that he had some sort of affair with a secretary doesn't really pass the smell test, because the money he got like fined or something. We know that for a fact, but it was like a very small fine to leave such a high-paying job and being a partner at Bear Stearns. It just didn't really seem like the real reason he left. And Vicky Ward, who's done a lot of reporting in the past on Jeffrey Epstein, she points to an investigation that was opened by the Security and Exchange Commission that was opened the day before Epstein left Bear Stearns. And apparently from her research, it seemed like Epstein left in connection with that investigation. And what's interesting is that the allegation, or rather the reason that investigation was opened, was because Epstein was accused, or rather Bear Stearns was accused of insider trading, specifically having received information from Edgar Bronfman, then owner of Seagram's, about a tender offer that Seagram's was offering on some mineral corporation or a mining company. And so Epstein was apparently involved in sort of that insider trading aspect of Bear Stearns, and appeared to have left in relation to that because the interviews, the transcripts of the interviews that Epstein gave to the SEC after he'd already left Bear Stearns, the people at the SEC were really skeptical of his answers, and there was some conflicting evidence. That's interesting because Edgar Bronfman, is one of the members of the Mega Group, which of course was co-founded by Charles Bronfman, Edgar's brother, and Leslie Wexner. And of course, we know that Leslie Wexner was one of the main financial backers of Epstein. I say financial backer because even though he's often described as a client of Epstein, there's a lot of evidence that Epstein was not actually wealthy and that his wealth came from somewhere else, and his only named client, i.e. source of money through this billionaire consulting firm, was Leslie Wexner.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out that Les Wexner, I mean, he's the founder and CEO of L Brands, which owns a lot of mall stores, limited.
Tons of mall stores, yeah.
Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, Express, Lane Bryant, Abercrombie & Fitch. And that's just an interesting detail that people might want to, think about that in your head, and how trafficking relates to global shipping and logistics operations that, they have.
We'll get into that. In a second, because that gets pretty crazy with how Wexner and Epstein were handling logistics for the Limited in the 90s. That gets really nuts. So anyway, he leaves Bear Stearns, right? And in connection with the Bronfmans, Mega Group, Wexner, just keep that in your brain for a little bit. Yeah. So after that, this is where Jeffrey Epstein's history gets super weird. And even a lot of people in mainstream media have basically avoided this period of Epstein's life, which I think is really telling. But basically, during this period of time, Epstein described what he was doing to friends and other sources who, were used by other journalists reporting on Epstein, like Vicky Ward and some others, say that he, was this financial bounty hunter, is the term that's most often used to describe what he was doing. He basically claimed that he would hunt down money for powerful people and governments, and he would also hide money for those same powerful people and governments. Well, that to me sounds sort of like tax evasion, offshore tax shelters. We know that Epstein was involved with that even, well into the 2000s. It also seems to indicate that he was involved in some sort of money laundering activity. But either way, he was involved in the world of shadow finance, case in point. One of the few named clients of Epstein during this period of time, which appears to have continued from when he left Bear Stearns in 1981 to 1985, or at least between 1985 and 1987, depending on what you on the date that he gets most closely associated with Leslie Wexner. He was involved in this world of shadow finance, and his only known client during this period of time was Adnan Khashoggi. And of course, Adnan Khashoggi, people might know who he is more recently because he is the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, who was the guy that was, dismembered in the embassy in Istanbul, the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, and that was got a lot of media coverage, right? But actually, Adnan Khashoggi, he was one of the main arms dealers involved in Iran-Contra. He was an asset not just for U.S. intelligence, but also Saudi intelligence and the Mossad. And he'd been on the payroll of the Mossad several years before 1981, but by 1981 he was definitely on it. And 1981 was also the year that he began doing arms deals for Iran-Contra. And he continued that until I believe 1985 or 1986. There were several other arms dealers involved in Iran-Contra besides Adnan Khashoggi, but what was interesting about Khashoggi is that he was considered the quote-unquote banker of the arms dealers because he was the one that would move the money around. He would do the financial aspect of the arms deals. So why would he hire someone like Jeffrey Epstein? Which I think is something we might want to ask ourselves here. It's also worth pointing out, too, that we know that a lot of the transactions that Khashoggi was doing in relation to this sort of activity during this period of time was through the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, which of course is the notorious CIA-linked bank. And it's also worth pointing out, too, that Bear Stearns, where Epstein had worked prior to working for Khashoggi, was a broker to BCCI. So not only do we have Khashoggi connected to BCCI, we have Khashoggi connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and we have Jeffrey Epstein connected to Bear Stearns, who's also connected to BCCI. So that, to me, suggests that Epstein, in his capacity as shadow finance operative for Khashoggi, was likely involved to some extent with BCCI as well. And something really crazy about BCCI that doesn't get as much coverage as its other activities because, of course, BCCI is most well known for money laundering, drug and arms trafficking, things like that. But it was also involved in sex trafficking to an extent as well, which does not get as much coverage. And actually, people that worked for BCCI in the United Arab Emirates, they would basically bribe top UAE officials by basically selling them prepubescent girls for sex. So BCCI was into that sort of activity. So again, as you mentioned earlier, one of the undercovered aspect of these types of, I would call them criminal rackets that are often done in connection with intelligence. Arms and drugs trafficking definitely happen and they get the most coverage, but sex trafficking is definitely something that happens even if it passes under the radar. This is where we see, Epstein get clearly involved with someone who's tied into intelligence. It's also worth pointing out, too, that Alan Greenberg, who had hired Epstein at Bear Stearns, was also a very close friend and associate of Roy Cohn, who we were talking about a little bit earlier. So that's another interesting tie-in there as well. So skipping ahead a little bit, after he stops and leaves this world of shadow finance, it's when he teams up with Leslie Wexner. He eventually becomes Leslie Wexner's, he basically gets power of attorney for Leslie Wexner, and he can hire and fire people for Wexner. He basically starts managing logistics for Wexner's company, L Brands, right? And L Brands, or the Limited, I forget exactly when the company changed its name. It used to be, it was the Limited and then it was L Brands or something like that. But anyway, this is Wexner's company. That's all these mall brands, all these stores in the mall. Beginning in 1994, Epstein, who's managing logistics for Wexner, obviously with Wexner's knowledge, they start to negotiate the relocation of a company called Southern Air Transport that's based in Miami, Florida, to Columbus, Ohio. The reason they want this airline to relocate is because they want them to run cargo for the Limited. They want it to bring, presumably, textiles from Hong Kong to Columbus and basically be the airline that runs this route for Wexner companies. The negotiations don't just involve the Limited and Southern Air Transport, they involve Ohio's government as well, which apparently under pressure from Wexner, who is one of the richest people in the entire state, basically ends up convincing Ohio's government to prepare this very attractive incentive package to Southern Air Transport to get them to relocate. And actually, once they relocate in 1995 to Columbus, after all, The top executives at Southern Air Transport cited that incentive package, a large portion of which was bankrolled by Ohio taxpayers, as the reason for the relocation. What's interesting here as well is that some of the key players besides Wexner and Epstein in getting that relocation to happen are Richard Secord and Alan Fiers, both of whom were very, very much involved with Iran-Contra. Actually, Alan Fiers was one of the guys that was charged in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal. I believe he was in charge of Central America operations for the CIA during Iran-Contra. So that's crazy, especially when you take into consideration that at this period of time, Southern Air Transport was the known CIA front company for Iran-Contra, the airline that was used for Iran-Contra operations, and was actually the airline used by Barry Seal to take stuff from Central America, from the Contras to Mena in Arkansas, the Mena airport, and back again. Out of all of the airlines in the United States during this period, Epstein and Wexner seek out the only one that is publicly known to be a CIA cutout, basically. That's really nuts. And also we know, too, that at some point in the 1990s, Epstein claimed that he previously worked for the CIA. We don't know exactly when he was claiming he worked for the CIA, whether it was in the 80s when he was involved with Khashoggi, or whether it was in connection with him and Southern Air Transport. But we know he was making those claims prior to the year 2001, when there was a report citing Epstein having made these claims, published in London's Evening Standard, that talked about, had different sources saying that Epstein had made this claim during this period of time.
Wow, you do have such a grip on this stuff, and there are so many different concentric rings of criminals and cabals.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It is so nuts. And I just really appreciate the work you've done. This has been really awesome. I think you have a real knack for this kind of work, and I hope people follow what you're doing after this. And maybe we should give them the links. Of course, mintpressnews.com. But is there anything else to give the people? Social media platforms you're most active on? I mean, you've done a great couple of podcasts, too.
Sure. The podcast for Mint Press News, which is the Mintcast, it's currently on hiatus. So I'll let people know on social media. And of course, Mint Press's pages on social media will let people know when that is functioning again. I have been in Facebook jail since April. They don't let me post any links on my author page. So I just kind of gave up on Facebook. So I mostly use Twitter. You can follow me at _Whitney Webb on there. And because I'm in Facebook jail, that's the platform I am most active on.
Right on. Well, great. It was a real treat to have you here. I'm glad we could highlight just a fantastic journalist like yourself. Keep doing what you do. There's definitely more to talk about. Hopefully we can do it again in the future, but stay vigilant and be careful out there.
Thanks. Sounds good to me. I'd love to be back on.
Oh, sweet baby Jesus. Hell of a show. Really happy to get this one out. And what? You thought we were only going to talk about Jeffrey Epstein once? Come on, don't be silly. Of course not. But big thanks to Whitney Webb for her excellent research and really great recall. I know a lot of people were sending me her articles, and I think even Gordon posted one. And I thought, yeah, we might retread a little ground here, but we have enough new threads that it's going to be well worth it. So I really appreciate her time. I know she was running on fumes because so many people have been trying to interview her. It's not as easy for THC to just push our way to the front of that line as it was 6 years ago. Number of podcasts probably doubles every year. And we know the Higher Side Chats is good, but how is someone in her position supposed to know? But whatever, we did it. And it is an instant classic as far as I'm concerned. You could probably tell as we got to the 45 minute mark that I was really trying to push us through the saga to get to some of the Clinton threads, because our show with Recluse was so heavy on the Trump, Barr, Cohn threads, and I really wanted to get to the other side of things. But we all know about Bill Clinton and the Mena, Arkansas airport smuggling. Although I've never heard anybody incorporate this third rail of human trafficking into that context that I can remember. So that was important and educational. I was really intrigued by the Leslie Wexner thread with Southern Air Transport. And here's a weird bit of Greg Carlwood history for you, and it probably means nothing, but one of the many stores that Les Wexner owns is Express. And when I moved from St. Louis to Columbia, Missouri, where the college is, my friend's mom had to ask around her corporate retail network to find a store in Columbia that would hire me because I had no resume or experience, and I just wanted to live in the college town with my friends without actually going to college because I had just dropped out. So she worked her magic and found me a job as the stockroom manager at Express because Express was not going to put me on the floor, especially then because I wasn't Express appropriate and was actually probably pretty anti-Express, but beggars can't be choosers, right? Well, as the stockroom manager, I would handle the shipments, and I remember expecting a big, nice semi-truck to pull up to the loading dock, and it would be this big official professional thing. But when I actually got shipments, it was way more casual than I thought. It was 3 guys in a regular pickup truck who didn't speak English, tossing me boxes out of the back. And I always thought that was kind of strange. It's not easy to find people who don't speak English in the middle of Missouri, first off, but it seemed quite amateur, you know? I'd see these FedEx and UPS guys bringing in the carts and delivering to all the other stores, but I'm this stressed out 19-year-old behind the building shouting, "That's for Express, right? Okay, a key. Here? See. Very little documentation for the process. And I would think, so did we get every box we were supposed to get? I have no idea. Not a big deal, probably not even relevant. It was just, I'm guessing, some cheap subcontractor. But it was the oddest shipping situation in the Columbia Mall, and I was in charge of it. And the owner of the company is apparently mixed up in some pretty sketchy shipping-related scandals. But anyway, I am glad that we got to talk about a lot more than just the Epstein case, though. I've made a few comments over the last couple of months or so about how I wanted to get our focus to be a bit more diverse or international in scope. And if you check out the interviews Whitney's been doing, at least the ones that I've heard, it's 100% Epstein, and I get it. That's trendy and obviously extremely interesting. But I saw the other articles that she's written, and I just thought, wow, these are really important too, and more unique. So let's start there. And I actually think we could do a whole show on this economic hitman stuff going on in the realm of controlling the world's food supply and forcing them to convert to GMO or else overthrowing their government. Obviously, it's an old tactic, the government working on behalf of corporations, getting them in to plunder resources and take over local distribution, like the old Chiquita banana scandal, right? But this is a lot worse because they're trying to remove organic alternatives from the whole planet, it seems. Attacking countries that start seed banks? I mean, what the hell is going on here? We talked about it with Joseph Farrell last time, I believe in the Plus show, and we got to talk about it today at the beginning, and I think it's a big enough issue to warrant more shows. Crazy stuff, but I'm feeling good. Just really happy with where the news site is now, that the kinks are all worked out. I'm really proud of the show offerings in August and September, and just really psyched about the future. It is a great time to sign up for Plus. The new website is going to treat you right, and we got a great lineup coming. In this extended interview with Whitney, we talked about crossing the line between Democrat and Republican, as well as CIA, Mossad, MI6. When you say a guy works for intelligence, can you really peg him to just one of these organizations? I don't think so. And we really hit the Wexner-Epstein connections hard and deep in that second hour. Talked about Lynn Forrester de Rothschild's surprising interest in Jeffrey Epstein, the state of the investigation now that Epstein has died, Whitney's thoughts on the New Mexico ranch and Epstein's master race plan. We also got into the controversial but possible prospect that Epstein is still alive, that he was extracted rather than murdered. Of questions about if the international investigations might yield better results than the ones carried out in the United States, and also how connected to the blackmail network Trump might be, and has the Trump administration really done anything differently politically? At least anything of conspiratorial significance. Lots of stuff that I think is worth your time, but you be the judge. Sign up at thehighersidechats.com. I guess the only real higher side news is that the joint session this month is going to be on the 25th, 7 p.m. Pacific. And I will be in Portland this week, hanging with Gordon White and Austin Coppock. I think there are 3 different meetups, and I should be at all 3. What do I got to do? So let's burn a few down, right? Really psyched to get a little vacation, hang with some colleagues, hang with some listeners potentially, and just get away from the computer screen, because August was rough. I think we all know August was rough for me. Can't talk about it forever, but still fresh. The wounds are still fresh. But all right, life's not so bad. I'm going to get out of here. Maybe I'll see you in Portland, people. Thanks again to Whitney Webb. Let her know THC is the place that she should be checking in with once in a while, because there are plenty of great shows that I think we could do. And I'll catch you next time. Your move, nefarious multinational trafficking operators, blackmail network bastards, and capstone cabals who have built their houses on nothing but sand. Your fucking move.
You know the plan has always been to hack your brain. MK Ultra's trying to drive you insane. They'll explode your heart if they think that's what it takes. You think I'm answering the phone? Well, I ain't. You gotta keep the curtains drawn, 'cause you don't want anyone thinking you're at home. Well, you're not. You should tape the mail slot. And baby, if I seem withdrawn, let me say it's 'cause I just don't wanna go and get whacked. Maybe you should know that the trauma affects you like it does everyone. It's just the game plan, it's what the world's become. They want a pat down and a swap. Don't you see what's going on? Well, now you know. You're better keeping on your own, 'cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it is, and you can only trust yourself. I hope you know the elite aren't your friends. They'll suck out everything from you in the end. And if for some reason you think I might be wrong, I wonder where you got that opinion from. You gotta keep the curtains drawn, 'cause you don't want anyone thinking you're at home. Well, you're not. You should tape the mail slot. And baby, if I seem withdrawn, let me say it's 'cause I just don't wanna go and get whacked. Maybe you should know that the trauma affects you like it does everyone. It's just the game plan, it's what the world's become. They want a pat down and a swap. Don't you see what's going on? Well, now you know. You're better keeping on your own, 'cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it is, and you can only trust yourself. You might think that these problems are small, or maybe they aren't registering at all. Now they know you're naive and vulnerable. You won't believe all of the stunts that they'll pull, 'cause you can see the sisters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it isn't. You can only trust yourself. Cause you can see the map